Here's British birds and the Catullus and the Holy War of Bargain. Every one of them with 5 volumes. You could just fill the gap on the second shelf. It looks untidy, does it not, sir? I moved my head to look at the cabinet behind me. When I turned again, Sherlock Holmes was standing smiling at me across my study table. I rose to my feet, stared at him for some seconds in utter amazement, and then it appears that I must have fainted for the first and the last time in my life. Certainly a grey mist swirled before my eyes, and when it cleared, I found my collar ends undone and the tingling aftertaste of brandy upon my lips. Holmes bending over my chair, his flask in his hand. "My dear Watson," said the well-remembered voice, "I owe you 1,000 apologies. I had no idea that you would be so affected." I gripped him by the arms. "Holmes," I cried, "is this really you? Can it indeed be that you are alive? Is it possible that you succeeded in climbing out that awful abyss?" "Wait a moment," said he. "Are you sure that you are really fit to discuss things? I have given you a serious shock of my unnecessarily dramatic reappearance. I am all right, but indeed, Holmes, I can hardly believe my eyes. Good heavens, to think that you of all men, should be standing in my study." Again I gripped him by the sleeve and felt the thin, sneery arms behind it. "Well, you are not a spirit anyhow," said I. "My dear chap, I am overjoyed to see you. Sit down and tell me how you come alive out of that dreadful sham." He sat opposite to me and lit a cigarette in his old nonchalant manner. He was dressed in the seedy frock coat of the book merchant, but the rest of that individual lay in a pile of white hair and old books upon the table. Holmes looked even thinner and leaner than of old, but there was a dead white tinge in the aquiline face which told me that his life recently had not been a healthy one. "I am glad to stretch myself, Watson," said he. It is no joke when a tall man has to take a foot off his stature for several hours on end. Now, my dear fellow, in the matter of these explanations, we have, if I may ask for your cooperation, a hard and dangerous night's work in front of us. Perhaps it would be better if I gave you an account of the whole situation when that work is finished. I am full of curiosity. I should have much preferred to hear now. You will come with me tonight, when you like and where you like. This is indeed like the old days. We shall have time for a mouthful of dinner before we need go. Well then, about this chasm. I had no serious difficulty in getting out of it for the very simple reason that I never was in it." "You never were in it?" "No, Watson, I never was in it. My note to you was absolutely genuine. I had little doubt that I had come to the end of my career when I perceived the somewhat sinister figure of the late Professor Moriarty standing upon the narrow pathway which led to safety. I reached an inexorable purpose in his grey eyes. I exchanged some remarks with him, therefore, and obtained his courteous permission to write the short note which you afterwards received. Left it with my cigarette box and my stick, and I walked along the pathway, Moriarty still at my heels. When I reached the end, I stood at bay. He drew no weapon, but he rushed at me and threw his long arms around me. He knew that his own game was up and was only anxious to revenge himself upon me. We tottered together upon the brink of the fall. I have some knowledge, however, of Baritsu, or the Japanese system of wrestling, which has more than once been very thankful to me. I slipped through his grip, and he, with a horrible scream, kicked madly for a few seconds and clawed the air with both his hands. But for all his efforts, he could not get his balance, and over he went with my face upon the brink. I saw him fall for a long way. Then he struck a rod, bounded off, and splashed into the water. I listened with amazement to his explanation, which Holmes delivered between the puffs of his cigarette. "But the tracks," I cried. "I saw with my own eyes that two went down the path and none returned." "It came about in this way. The instant that the professor had disappeared, it struck me What a really extraordinary lucky chance fate had placed in my way. I knew that Moriarty was not the only man who had sworn my death. There were at least three others whose desire for vengeance upon me would not be increased by the death of their leader. They were all most dangerous men. One or other would certainly get me. On the other hand, if all the world was convinced that I was dead, they would take liberties. This meant they would soon lay themselves upon, and sooner or later I could destroy them. Then it would be time for me to announce that I was still in the land of the living. So rapidly does the brain act that I believed I had thought this all out. Professor Moriarty had reached the bottom of the region best for. I stood up and examined the rocky wall behind me. In your picture's account of the matter, which I read with great interest some months later, you assert the wall was sheer. That was not literally true. A few small footholds presented themselves, and there was some indication of a ledge. The cliff is so high that to climb it all was an obvious impossibility, and it was equally impossible to make my way along the wet path without leaving some tracks. I might, it is true, have reserved my boots as I have done on similar occasions, but the sight of three sets of tracks in one direction would certainly have suggested a deception. On the whole, then, it was best that I should risk the climb. It was not a pleasant business, Watson. The fall roared behind me. I am not a fanciful person, but I give you my word that I seemed to hear Moriarty's voice screaming at me out of the abyss. Mistake would have been fatal. More than once, as tufts of grass came out in my hand or my foot slipped in the wet notches of the rock, I thought I was gone, but I struggled upwards, and at last I reached a ledge several deep. To be continued. Here's British birds and the catulars and the holy war of